Dr. Vanessa M. Holden.
Well, it's great to be here this afternoon on a beautiful fall day. I'm happy to talk about a book for young people that's about what can be seen as a pretty intense topic, but a very important one. So today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Shawn's new graphic narrative, Nat Turner's Rebellion. It's actually in a historical series for young people, and it's aimed at young people aged 8 to 11.
Yeah, 8 to 11, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
So middle graders, solidly middle graders. If I were approached and asked to write something for middle graders about the rebellion that I study, I think I'd be a little bit overwhelmed by that. So let's talk about writing and researching slavery first, and then we'll get into how you translate it to young people. So American slavery is a research subject that is overwhelming in a lot of ways. How did you tackle research for telling the story of the Southampton Rebellion?
Okay, a lot of it, I had to realize that when Capstone editor Julie Gassman, she had come to me and she said, hey, we are revising a lot of our graphic library, graphic novels, and we're bringing a new version of Nat Turner's Rebellion out, and we would like for you to write it. And I've written lots of graphic novels and comics over the span of 14 years. And so this was different, though, because we are telling a historical narrative, but it's for 8 to 11-year-olds. I've got 28 pages to talk about an intense rebellion, and also to talk about slavery, and to also talk about religion, and to also talk about who was willing to participate, who isn't willing to participate, the hysteria and also propaganda of the people in Southampton, Virginia, that were against the rebellion, and some of the things that they did to combat against it, in 28 pages. And not to mention the fact that we also talk about the first 31 years of Nat Turner's life in 8 pages. So basically I have 4 8-page chapters to go through the first 31 years of Nat Turner's life, the building of the rebellion, or at least the Nat Turner's first time he ran away from the plantation, then came back, then his learning about his vision from God, saying, okay, now is the time for us to rebel against our slave masters, building the army, going from plantation to plantation. Wait a minute, I didn't even answer the question that you asked me. I'm sorry, I got on a tangent. Learning about how things went in Southampton with slavery, also in the same area that did have some free black people there. There were some free black people that I did not know. And I did talk with some historical professors. Also dealt with a consultant from, a gentleman by the name of James Dymock from Minnesota State University. And so we shared barbs as far as, okay, is this correct? Because we have to tell the correct narrative as well. But what I didn't know was that I did not know that Nat Turner was a preacher. And I didn't know that Nat Turner led a lot of sermons. One thing that I didn't know, which isn't told enough in my graphic novel because I didn't have the room for it, was the involvement of black women in the rebellion. Not just in the not just forming the rebellion, not just being a part of the rebellion, but being a part of everything within that community. And that's just something that we did not have the space to put in because there weren't enough pages. And so that was something that I wish we could have talked about more. Now, your book talks about that. African-American women in resistance in Nat Turner's community. But no, I think that was one thing that I wish we would have been able to get into a little bit more.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, when was the first time you learned about the Southampton Rebellion?
It was after college, actually. It was 3 years after I graduated. We never talked about Nat Turner's Rebellion in grade school, middle school, high school, and even in college. And I took a number of historical classes and history classes, never talked about that. Grade school, middle school, it was slaves, Lincoln freed the slaves, Martin Luther King was born, I Have a Dream speech, the end. That was it. That was grade school, middle school, high school. College, a little bit different. You had more classes of choice, but even then, a lot of times, Black history and intense moments in Black history are kind of just swept under. Sorry about that. Swept under the rug.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about it, I think there was maybe a picture from the time period in a textbook in high school, and it's mentioned, and then more time was spent on all the other things that were happening in the antebellum period. This particular rebellion wasn't well talked about. When I was in college, I learned more and read primary documents from the rebellion, and that inspired my undergraduate thesis. But it's slavery is this topic that gets sort of glossed over or quickly moved past. And there are a whole number of reasons for why that is. But one of them is often that educators either feel like they themselves didn't learn enough about the topic to actually accurately talk about it. And working with K through 12 educators, I've heard that over and over again. Or they're kind of worried about what the response is going to be. If that becomes, even when it's a part of local history, if that becomes a part of what they're talking to young people about. So I was wondering, you said you worked with a historical consultant. You said you really wanted to get the story right. Did you look at Nat Turner's own Jailhouse Confessions? It's maybe one of the most famous reproduced documents from the rebellion.
Yes.
It's heavily mediated because it was written down for him by a white lawyer in Southampton County who fully intended to make money by selling it after the fact. And yet you can still get some shadows of his own feelings and words. So I was wondering, did you read the confessions? Do they end up in this narrative at all?
The lawyer shows up in the graphic novel to tell, and you have Nat Turner says, well, this is what I've done, this is what I did. But I did get to read snippets of the confession because there was some additional research material that I was able to acquire, and I did get to read snippets of it. But it's also one of those things where there isn't enough space. There is enough space in the graphic novel to put all of that in there. So it's more of, okay, here's the lawyer, here's Nat Turner confessing, this is what I've done, and then here's the trial.
Yeah, I mean, it's also all written in 19th century language. That's not particularly accessible for 8 to 11-year-olds.
No.
Kyle Baker, who he's an artist. His whole graphic novel for adults about the rebellion, titled Nat Turner, all of its text comes directly from the confessions.
Yes.
That wouldn't work for the audience you're working with.
No.
But it's maybe the one document that gives us even kind of a tiny peek into how Turner would have wanted to represent himself. And I kind of want to move on to thinking about the medium that you're working in here. This is not your first graphic narrative.
No.
It's not your first graphic novel. You are already thinking about writing for young people in that medium. And so I wondered if you could speak to what is different about writing for a graphic novel. I'll ask you a little bit about working with an artist.
Okay, cool.
After you give us a taste of.
Yeah. When you do things like, say, for instance, like when you do graphic novels, when you're writing graphic novels, you're writing comics, especially from something of a historical aspect, that what the page count is what gets you. In my eyes, in my mind, if we had the money to do so with Capstone, Nat Turner's Rebellion probably would have been 120 pages. But their whole thing is that we want to make this quick and effective. Here are the bullet points. Here are the facts. Hopefully the kids can get it. Let's make sure they remember just these base points here. Let's move to the next story. And I understand that. I get that because also you're dealing with children. You're dealing with children. Sometimes those attention spans are short. So we need to make this book short. So the thing is also there's a thing of violence because Nat Turner's rebellion is not a peaceful rebellion. There are no sit-ins in this rebellion. There is violence. There's people getting stabbed. There are people getting shot. There are militias going up against Nat Turner. There are Nat Turner's rebellion going up against the militias. There were many lives lost. If I recall correctly, about his Nat Turner's rebellion was about 70. It was close to 60 or 70 slaves, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, somewhere between 50 and 70.
Between 50 and 70. But when it was all said and done, didn't they say like around, I want to say close to 40 may have died, and then like many were jailed?
So the rebels themselves
Yes.
murdered almost 60 white men,
Right.
women, and children.
Right, yes.
It depends on how you want to do the counting about how many people died, black
Right.
people died as a result of the rebellion.
Yes.
But yeah.
But you're also dealing with the fact is you're telling the story and there's so much violence and it's like, okay, how do we show that? How do we explain it? Because it can't be too graphic. So you don't see anyone getting killed per se. You may see somebody striking a sword up. You might see somebody pointing a gun at somebody where the shot has already gone off and somebody is on the ground, but you're not going to see the actual act of violence. You will see before or after. We also have to talk about the fact that, like, in that rebellion, the way a lot of people think about it, a lot of people think that Nat Turner did so much killing. He led the rebellion, but he only killed one person. The entire rebellion killed one person. But like the rest of his party did a lot of the killing. But it seems as if it's always played off as he's the one that did everything. He's the one that did all the killing. It's not true. He only killed one person. One.
And I wanted to ask you about depictions of violence for this age group. Now, this is a series, the graphic library series doesn't really shy away from the more difficult aspects of American history. They have an issue dedicated to the Hindenburg disaster, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the Titanic sinking. So it's not as if that this series, they also have like Paul Revere and Paul Revere's Ride and Ben Franklin. And,
yes.
Right. So it's not that the whole thing is violence. But the series doesn't shy away from,
No.
tragedies and violent episodes in history. This isn't the only violent episode. But something that struck me, as you mentioned, there aren't any depictions of enslaved people murdering enslavers. It's implied.
Right, it's implied,
and
yes.
it is named. That's
Yes.
the thing that happened. But there are depictions of enslavers perpetrating violence on enslaved people.
Yes. Yes.
So did you make that choice? Or was that a choice that was made by the artist, or did you make that choice together, and why?
Okay, now that could be, let's see, how can I say this? Okay, in a situation like that, that is where we're dealing with the editor as well, and artist. And so, and in a lot of ways, I think it's also to show the readers that, okay, yes, these people are enslaved. We have to show them that they are enslaved, and they're also being punished. And this is why it will justify why Nat Turner feels that he was called upon God to start this rebellion. Now, even though we both know that slavery is wrong, and a lot of people, everybody should know slavery is wrong, the way the editors set this book up is like, well, we understand that slavery is wrong, but we still have to show people the violence towards the slaves as a catalyst as to why Nat Turner feels that all slaves should be free. And kind of feel a way about that because we all know slavery is wrong, but like, do we still have to show that visual depiction, even though the other way around, when the rebellion begins and they fight up against militias, they fight up against slave plantation homes to free more slaves, you don't see that brutality on the other side visually. And so like that is one of the things that I think I struggled with when the book came out. And I still question that. But like I was like, well, maybe it's because they need to see the catalyst as to why. But at the same time, if they're showing that, why can't we show it on the other side as well?
Yeah, and I think I get that question a lot when I give talks about my own work. Why did this happen? And I think that because the Southampton Rebellion was successful, it sticks in people's minds as an outrageously violent moment. But the truth is, the 1830s were a really violent time.
Yeah.
Violence was like its own language that everybody could speak. And enslaved people were dealing with the fact that, at least in Virginia, their value on the open market went up. And so a lot of friends, neighbors, kin, children were being sold by enslavers to the Deep South.
Yes.
Communities are really being ripped apart. There are sort of different layers of violence in slavery. And I think, in the short space that you have, you really touch on, yes, there's physical violence, but you touch on different kinds of violence and grief.
Yes.
Of course, the rebellion ends. Yesterday, actually, was the 190th anniversary of Nat Turner's court trial. That resulted in a guilty verdict. That was not a hard verdict for local justices to reach.
No.
His execution happened on the 11th, so we've got a few more days until that anniversary comes up. So the book, of course, like most biographical books, has to end with the death of the main character. How did you handle really capturing and recreating that particular death?
That was difficult because I knew that, once again, graphically, they weren't going to show him dying. So, and I even asked about that. I'm like, okay, what am I allowed to do here? And they said, well, you can have a cap show, you can have a panel of the actual trial. You can have a panel of him giving, Nat Turner giving his disposition to the lawyer. And you will see the hangman's noose. And you will see the platform that Nat Turner is on. That's it. You will, and it will say in text, that he died on this day and he was hung. But you're not going to see the actual hanging. You are going to get the implication, because once again, you're dealing with children, and and also at the same time, the publisher is worried about the visual interpretation of that. So they just say, if we give the shadow of the noose, give a shadow of the platform, and the shadow of Nat Turner in his last moments, that should hopefully be impactful enough.
So where in the story did you take artistic license?
Now,
I know you didn't draw the novel. You worked with an artist.
Right.
Where did you find that you took some license with the story, or decided to kind of arrange things maybe differently for this audience?
I would say the moments where, as in the beginning, when Nat Turner runs away the first time, because the first time in his early 30s, well, like I think he's probably 30 at the time, maybe. Nat Turner decides to run away from the plantation on his own. He's just like, nope, it's time for me to go. I'm going. And he runs away and he escapes. And 8 weeks later, he's starving. He's starving. He's struggling. And he's like, okay, maybe God is telling me I wasn't ready for this yet. And he goes back to the plantation. And everybody's like, why did you come back? You were free. Why did you come back? And he's like, it's not my time. And then like the slaves are just like, no, you're foolish. Why would I listen to you? Why would I listen to you? Why would I believe you when you say you're a person that got God and God told you that he wanted you to come back? So there's a little bit of like interpretation, a little bit like you can kind of play with there. And even when he decides to do the actual rebellion, like he got sick before attempting the first rebellion, so they had to put it on hold. There's a little bit, I don't want to say twisting of words as much as the placement and how it's talked about. We play with that a little bit too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important also to think about. I don't know how much of a hand you had in the way panels were set up, or really the sort of aesthetics of the graphic novel. It's really different. There was a version of this this book is an update to,
Yes.
and that graphically looked. Um, it looked a little more cartoonish in
Yes.
its it wasn't a caricature by any means, but it looked a little bit more cartoonish, a lot of round lines, definitely not the kind of really superhero aesthetic,
Right.
that you get in this version.
Yes.
Did you have a hand in making decisions around that, or was that left up to the artist?
That was left to editorial and the artist. I do know that when they decided to do this book, they definitely wanted the tone and the look and the feel to be different of the book that came out a decade ago. The version that came out a decade ago, when that came out, that book was good for that time. But now, like I said, because there are things about that book that came out a decade ago, like there were some civil liberties taken, in my personal opinion. Like I said, I can't remember all off the top of my head, but it feels that there were things missing. Whereas with this version, the art is a little bit darker. I think you get various shades of black, and that's something in comics comics and graphic novels that they're still trying to learn, as far as like when you're dealing with black people drawing black people come in all different shades and colors, like the scale and range goes from 0 to 1,000. And so that was something Silvio DB, the artist for Nat Turner's Rebellion, was trying to get across. And also he wanted to convey the mood of the story, and the mood is dark. And so you're going to get a lot of dark tones. You're going to get a lot of dark shadows. A lot of the stuff happens at night. But like the whole mood of the story is dark, because it's not a lighthearted story. And Silvio DB wanted to make sure that came across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed that too in some of the other updates in the series. I don't know how this is possible, but the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire for kids was, also had a kind of cartoonish aesthetic, and now there's, the actual fire is on the forefront on the cover. It has some kind of like more sinister tones, and so one question that I had is, I wondered, why do you think it's important for there to be an accessible text like this for 8 to 11-year-olds? A lot of people would say, oh, this is too much. Sure, there are ways to talk about slavery, but why would you start with a story like this? Why write this?
I think it's because all Black history is history. Like we need to know it all. Like I said before, when I didn't know about this until I was in my mid to late 20s. I should have known about this like at least by middle school. Even if it was only a paragraph in a book, I should have known about this in middle school. And there's so much history of ours, which is American history as well. And it should be in there. Like these things happened and we have to accept them. And if we don't accept them, that's how history repeats itself. And so we can't continue to bury this stuff. The kids have to know. Like I personally don't feel that like this will scare children. I personally feel that it's informative, it's necessary, because this country has been fantastic at repeating its own mistakes over and over. But I think books like these are a good way to make kids understand that we can progress, move forward, do better, be better for everyone.
I also think, graphic novels and graphic narratives are accessible in a really different way. If you have a young person who maybe struggles with reading,
Yes.
A young person who doesn't like social studies, doesn't like history, but really does like fantasy or really does like that this is a different entry point.
Yes.
Some of it isn't that they really don't like history so much as they don't like the history they're being taught. They're not
Yes.
particularly engaged by it.
Graphic novels and comic books are a fantastic gateway to reading, period. Like for me as a child, when growing up, I was like, at the age of 3, I was reading on like a second grade level at the age of 3. And so I would read anything I could get my hands on. So one day my mom comes home with a stack of comic books, stuff like Richie Rich. I'm really showing my age. Richie Rich, some Super Friends comics, and a copy of Iron Man. And I want to say that issue was the very first appearance of James Rhodes, aka Rhodey, as Iron Man. You don't see his face, but you know it's a black dude on the front cover because you see that little fro as he's putting that helmet over his head. And my mom said, if you can give me like, if you can read all these and tell me what happened in each of these, I'll go get you more. I was like, oh, okay, cool. This is a challenge. Bet, let's go. And so that was the gateway to reading for me. And it's been with me ever since. And comics, graphic novels have been part of my life ever since. I've been writing for over 14 years. And the first 10 years of my life, it's comics and graphic novels. And now I've moved, also do prose, children's books, storybooks and whatnot. I've expanded, my writing abilities, but graphic novels are great. A great visual form, a great written form. And for like the longest time in schools were against comics. They were against graphic novels. They thought it was the junk food of reading. It's not. It's not. Not every comic book is a superhero book, and not every comic book is a graphic novel is a slice of life. A slice of life story. There are so many things that graphic novels can do. And one thing they can do very well is educate.
Yeah, and I've noticed this in titles for grown-ups. I'm looking out at the audience today. We don't have anybody in your particular target age group. But I mentioned Kyle Baker's Nat Turner, which is a really gorgeous graphic novel about the rebellion. There's a new graphic novel out by Rebecca Hall called Wake that's about women-led slave rebellion. And honestly, she's also a character in this graphic novel doing the research. It's kind of fascinating. And there are also a few adaptations of Octavia Butler's work. This kind of bridging, a really amazing sci-fi writer with really gorgeous, lush visuals. Kindred, which is Butler's book that involves time travel and slavery. The Parable of the Sower is now a graphic novel. And seeing this kind of genre bending is bringing Black literature and Black stories to audiences that maybe would not have picked up those stories. But it's also allowing for Black readers and Black youth to see themselves reflected in a popular medium. And to some extent, just the visual, that you have any visuals at all. It becomes really, really important. Like you said, being able to see the glimpse of a fro, or the kind of elastic universe that Marvel's creating right now, wherein there are different timelines and different variations of different characters, and so you can say what if, and things like gender, race, class, all those things can be played with. Representation can be played with.
Oh yeah, the comics world and the graphic novel world is playing this amazing game of catch up right now, to where they finally realize that like I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people, various race, colors, and creeds, read graphic novels and comics. Period. And so a lot of these publishers like, wow, we've left all this money on the table for how many decades? Are you serious? Let's go make some changes. Let's go have some fun with this. And it's been a blessing in a lot of ways. Now we still got a long way to go. We still have a long way to go. I'm dealing with some comic publishers right now, trying to get some ideas off the ground, as well as dealing with book publishers with my literary agent. And there's still those color lines that come through where they're like, well, we're not sure about this. Can we sell this? Can we move this? And those same questions and blockades that have been set up since like the 60s and the 70s. And so we're trying to get over that hump so we can give you more of our stories. Doesn't mean that everybody else's stories are going away, because they're not. They're still here. Watchmen is still here. Watchmen have been around for how many decades? The Dark Knight Returns, which almost every superhero for like 2 decades based their stories off of, Watchmen and The Dark Knight. And that's a whole other story for a whole other time, but I won't get into that right now. Like that stuff's been around. That stuff's been around forever, and like people still base a lot of these stories off of those two books alone. And there were stories by people that look like us that were trying to get out around the same time, and were on the smallest channels possible, even though they wanted to be a part of those larger channels that couldn't get there. But now we're getting to this place where it's not even yet, and we're far away from being even, but it's getting a little better.
So let's talk a little bit about your other work and new work that you have coming up. You know, this is a historical
Yes.
project, but your work has a really broad range of topics and characters. And so, what's coming up next? What sorts of themes, stories do you think middle graders need right now?
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. Right now, I'm working on a graphic novel that's going to come out with FSG Macmillan with artist Courtney Hawn. It's called Fastbreak, and it's about a basketball prodigy by the name of Michaela Thomas. Her family, her mother gets the job of a lifetime, so they end up moving across town, new school, better school, better education, better way of living. However, it's right before basketball season starts. And so Michaela wants to try out for the girls' basketball team at the new school, but the coach is like, sorry, already had tryouts, got my team, go away. Don't care how good you are, doesn't matter to me. And basketball is her life. And so our art history teacher pulls her to the side and says, listen, I got a co-ed basketball team. It's funded by the school. It's a brand new league. It's a brand new thing. I know it's not what you want, but you can come play basketball. And the story is that Michaela learns that sometimes the thing you want most may not be the thing you need. And it's also a story about learning that you don't have to take everything on yourself, learning that family just isn't your own bloodline. It's from the people that you grow around with and share emotions and stories and feelings with. And I can't wait for everybody to see that. And that comes out spring 2023. But in the meantime, I have a high-low reader series called The Gamer coming out through Capstone with artist Francesca Ficarilli. It's about a 13-year-old kid who turns into a superhero. He has a device that he says gamer transform, and he turns to a superhero, and he kind of looks, the color aesthetics are that of a Nintendo Switch. And they're like 500 word books. They're for like young kids, middle readers. It's one of those things like if your kids don't read, this will be the way to get them hooked on reading. And that series comes out in January. There's 4 books, and I'm working on another 4 right now. As a matter of fact, I got to turn in another one on Monday. Oh, okay. So
okay, well, we'll run this clock out. You can finish up your series.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, but no, doing a bunch of stuff for Capstone. A lot of Jake Maddox books for them, and I also have a graphic novel series that I'm getting back to called Cash and Carrie with Marcus Kwame Anderson and Julie Speziani. It's about 2 best friends, Dallas Cash and Inez Carrie. They solve mysteries, and I also have The Deadliest Race, a scary graphic novel from Capstone with artist, I want to say Alan Brown. And there's a lot more stuff too. I've been a busy man these last 2.5 years.
You just out here writing things.
And holding a 9-to-5. Yes. I got bills to pay. I got a wedding to help pay for.
That's right. This man has a wedding coming up. Exactly.
Yes.
Congratulations.
But I love writing. And so, yes.
Well, I think, we're all excited to hear about all of these new titles for anybody with young people in their life, or not so young people, graphic novels, and some of the titles that Shawn has just mentioned are a great way to introduce them to reading, get them into reading when maybe they don't quite feel like they're comfortable with it. And sometimes just seeing the visual of a character who looks like you is enough to get a young person to buy in. Of course, I wish all titles were historical titles. But even if your young person is not into history, there are lots of great titles by Shawn that they can access. Do we have time for questions?
We sure do. So if you guys have questions, just raise your hand. I'm happy to come to you. All right, great. Right up here.
Oh, hey, now.
Well, Shawn, first of all, you sold a book to me. And so just to help with your wedding. No, I have a question. You said you had basic that you wanted to as takeaways. What would be 1 or 2 of the basic points you want people to take away from the graphic novel.
Oh, basic points to take away of the graphic novel for the Nat Turner graphic novel. Okay, the basic points that Capstone told me that like I had to make sure had to happen was I had to talk about his birth. I had to make sure I talked about the first time he ran away from the plantation, the punishment he faced from running away from the plantation, the sign, the quote unquote sign that he received from God during a solar eclipse, saying that was the time for him to run away. The planning of the rebellion, the actual rebellion itself, the fact that they had to go from plantation to plantation to try to free as many slaves as possible to build the army. Then the battle against the militia, where they actually killed about 20 militiamen. And then to the fact that like the next militia they fought in the next plantation house they found, folks were already ready for them, and they lost the majority of their army, and and to the point where he got captured. Like I had those, as I said, those are the key points you have to hit. Like if those things are not in this story, we cannot put this book out. It's like that was a must. And the thing is that so much of it is told, yes, visually, it's told visually, but there's a lot of captions. So yes, there is dialogue, but like a lot of it is caption heavy because, you know, we have to say this is how they got from point A to point B, this is how they got from point B to point C to D to E to F. But like those points had to be in that book because some of that stuff wasn't in the previous book. It wasn't. And so like we were playing a tremendous game of catch up to make sure that this version was more factual. And not just hey, slavery is bad. This is why this dude decided to break free and him and his friends decided to go and take down these plantations. No, it's more than that. It's deeper than that. And we had to with Silvio, had to show this is why we had to do it this way. And I hope I answered your question. Oh, here we go. Microphone's coming.
You said there was more deeper than that. I understand the need for the specific events.
Yes.
But maybe I'm more interested in your deeper message or what you were trying to get your readers to understand.
I was trying to get my readers to understand that Nat Turner's deep devotion to the fact that he felt that God said that he was the messenger to start the rebellion to free the slaves, because he was like, we are all equal. So why are we being treated this way? And if you don't stop treating us this way, well, guess what? We're just going to have to take all this over. Because the end goal was we want to get to, I forget the actual town, the actual area. Jerusalem, and we can be free there. We can build our families there. We can build a wedding there.
Well, I mean, there was an arsenal there, yeah.
Yes, that's right, the arsenal. Yes, thank you, the arsenal.
Fend off people who didn't want them to do that.
So more weapons, and we can continue to grow and build this army as we go further, because it's kind of like a tour. We could take this worldwide. Didn't get that far though. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to make sure people understood how devoted Nat Turner was to making this rebellion a reality and making freedom a reality for as many Black people as possible.
Shawn, I think this nice gentleman has a follow-up question.
Not for Shawn, but for Dr. Holden, if possible. You mentioned tense moments of Black history. I gather slavery is one of the tense moments. Yeah, are there any other moments you single out in particular?
I think when I was talking about tense moments, I was more thinking about figuring out how to convey that to young people, particularly a very young audience. 8 to 11-year-olds is pretty young. And students learn about racism, and slavery in all sorts of ways. Unfortunately, a lot of those ways are not ever in a classroom. They learn it through living their daily lives, noticing how adults treat each other around them. Of course, there are any number of moments in time in Black history that can be seen as tense. tense for who is also a really good question. I think, one of the things that the Southampton Rebellion teaches us is that Black people fought back. And I know as a young person that this graphic novel is aimed at. When I was 8 to 11 years old, I knew about slavery, and I knew from visiting historic sites with my family about slavery, but I didn't know very much about the ways that Black people fought back. I didn't learn about the subtle ways that people resisted slavery. I didn't learn about the overwhelming, overt ways that people resisted slavery. And had I learned about that as an 8 to an 11-year-old, it would have been really empowering. I wanted to ask you about the depictions of violence in this graphic novel. It's one thing to depict violence against African Americans. It's another thing to show the ways that Black people consistently resisted enslavement. And that's something that young people need to see more of, particularly Black young people. So if I had to pick, any one moment, I don't know that I could. The Black freedom struggle is a long and ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The struggle looks different from generation to generation, but I don't know that we're past a time where at least our country isn't working out tension around race.
One more question, perhaps? Does anybody have another question? I do. I have one for Shawn. Oh, you do? Great. Hang on, Shawn. You don't need to hear from me. Hold on.
Okay. No problem.
How did you get into the industry of making graphic novels?
I'm sorry, could you speak up, please?
How did you get into the industry of making and creating your graphic novels?
At first, I started in 2007. I was writing independently, learning how to make comics on my own with friends. And from 2007 to 2009, I just made my own comics independently. Then stumbled onto a comic book publisher, started publishing books through them. And those books ended up in comic book stores. Did that for a while on and off for about 6-7 years. Took a break. And then a couple years later, I stumbled upon an opportunity with Capstone, writing books for them, which then eventually later led to writing Nat Turner's Rebellion. And from there, I acquired a literary agent in the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And that really opened up a lot of doors for me because literary agents can get you in places that sometimes you as an individual cannot be. And so that's opened up the doors to book publishers and better opportunities. But it all started with me 14 years ago, learning how to make comics by myself and with and friends online, and learning and basically reading all the old comics I read as a kid to comics that are currently out at that time, and learning how to build comics and graphic novels that way. And then as I got older, I met other people in the comic book industry. I met artists, I met other writers, and learned from them. We shared our highs and lows with each other, and continued to build that way. And but now my career is very diverse, from book publishers to comic book publishers, even to game companies. And a lot of it is, honestly, a lot of people have emailed me out the blue. Sometimes I've had to hunt. Sometimes I had to send submissions, but sometimes that one email comes in and it could change everything for you. And but the only way I was able to get here is that I started on my own 14 years ago, and I didn't stop.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shawn and Dr. Holden, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon.